Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer Amanda Clark was reaching for her third cup of coffee when the emergency alert pierced the relative quiet of the Portland Police Bureau's East Precinct. It was 3:47 a.m. on a fog-shrouded Tuesday in October 2019, and the city seemed wrapped in an unnatural stillness that made even veteran officers uneasy. "We've got a 10:54 at the Hawthorne Bridge," dispatch crackled through the radio. Possible jumper, but the pause stretched longer than protocol allowed. "Units on scene are requesting immediate backup. Something's not right about this one." Clark, a 15-year veteran who'd worked everything from gang violence to domestic disputes, had developed an instinct for when something was genuinely wrong versus routine tragedy. The hesitation in the dispatcher's voice triggered that instinct now. "Unit 247 responding," she radioed back, already grabbing her keys and jacket. The fog outside her patrol car was so thick it seemed solid, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. As she drove toward the bridge, an odd detail caught her attention. Every radio and every car she passed was playing the same station, the same song, even though the vehicles were tuned to different frequencies. The Hawthorne Bridge stretched across the Willamette River like a skeletal finger, its steel framework disappearing into the gray void above. Clark parked behind two other patrol cars, their red and blue lights creating an eerie disco effect in the dense fog. Officers Martinez and Chen stood at the bridge's center, both looking unusually pale. "What have we got?" Clark called as she approached. "That's just it," Martinez replied, his voice tight. "We don't know. Got a call about a jumper 20 minutes ago. Caller said they saw someone climb over the railing, but when we got here..." He gestured helplessly at the empty space. "No body in the water? No body anywhere. But look at this." Chen led her to the bridge's eastern side. The caller was specific, said they saw a woman in a red dress climb over right here. "But there's this." Clark examined the railing where Chen pointed. Embedded in the metal, as if pressed there by enormous heat, was a perfect handprint. But it wasn't a normal handprint. It appeared to be burned into the steel, and the metal around it had an odd, iridescent quality like oil on water. "That's not possible," Clark muttered, running her own hand over the marking. The metal was warm, which made no sense in the October chill. Steel doesn't just melt like that, not from human contact. "Gets weirder," Martinez added. "Radio's been acting up since we got here. Keep picking up voices that aren't on any of our channels." As if summoned by his words, Clark's radio suddenly crackled to life with a woman's voice, clear as if she were standing right beside them. "They're not ready to see what's coming through. The frequency is all wrong. It's bleeding through where it shouldn't." All three officers stared at Clark's radio. She quickly checked the channel. It was set to the department's secure frequency, but the voice definitely wasn't dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Unit 247, Clark called. "Did you copy that transmission?" "Unit 247, this is dispatch. Negative on any traffic from your location. Your signal's coming through clear. Are you having equipment problems?" Before Clark could respond, her radio erupted again, this time with multiple voices overlapping. "The bridge holds them between." She opened the way. The frequency killer found the right resonance. Then silence. The fog began to thin slightly, revealing more of the bridge's span. That's when Clark noticed something that made her blood run cold. Along the bridge's entire length, spaced roughly 10 feet apart, were more handprints burned into the metal railing. Dozens of them, all glowing faintly in the dim light. "How many calls have we had about jumpers from this bridge in the past month?" Clark asked, though she dreaded the answer. Martinez pulled out his notebook. 7. All at night, all during heavy fog. But here's the thing. We never found any bodies. Coast Guard's been searching, but the water's been clean. 7 jumpers, no bodies, and now we've got... Clark counted the handprints visible in the lifting fog. At least 20 handprints burned into solid steel. Her radio crackled once more, but this time the voice was different, masculine, urgent. "Officer Clark, you need to understand. They're not jumping, they're being called through. The frequency creates a bridge between dimensions and she's learning to tune it perfectly. Tonight's just a test run." Clark felt ice in her veins. The voice had used her name, her actual name, not her unit number. She keyed her radio with trembling fingers. "Identify yourself. How do you know my name?" The response came immediately. "Because I'm one of the 7. My name was David Thompson. I was on duty 6 nights ago when I heard the frequency. It starts as music. Beautiful music that gets inside your head. By the time you realize it's not coming from any radio, it's too late. You can't resist walking to the bridge." Martinez grabbed Clark's arm. "Thompson's been missing for a week. Went off duty and never made it home. We've been searching for him." The voice continued through the radio. "She's using radio waves as a conduit. Every frequency becomes part of her web. The handprints aren't from climbing over, they're from trying to hold on while being pulled through. We're trapped between dimensions now, feeding her power so she can reach more of you." Clark's hands were shaking as she reached for her radio, but before she could respond, every radio within earshot, car radios, her handheld, Martinez's radio, even Chen's portable scanner, began broadcasting simultaneously. The cacophony was overwhelming. Dozens of voices, all talking at once, all describing the same thing. They spoke of a woman who had learned to manipulate radio frequencies to create tears in reality. They described being lured by irresistible music that seemed to come from inside their own heads. They told of being pulled through holes in space while their fingers burned into metal from desperate attempts to resist. And they all ended with the same warning. "She's getting stronger. The more of us she takes, the wider she can make the tears. Soon she won't need the bridge. Soon she'll be able to reach through any radio anywhere." Clark looked at her 2 fellow officers, seeing her own terror reflected in their faces. The fog was lifting rapidly now, revealing the full scope of what they were dealing with. The entire length of the Hawthorne Bridge was covered in handprints. Hundreds of them, glowing with that same eerie iridescence. "We need to get off this bridge," she said quietly. "Now." But as they turned to leave, Clark's radio whispered one final message, this time in a voice that definitely wasn't human. "Too late, Amanda. I've been tuning your frequency since you arrived. Can you hear it yet? The music?" And she could. Somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the sounds of traffic and wind and water, was the faintest trace of melody. Beautiful, compelling, and definitely not coming from any radio she could see. The frequency killer had found her. The first documented case of what Portland police would later classify as frequency-related disappearances began 3 months earlier, though it would take weeks for anyone to recognize the pattern. Officer Marcus Webb had been patrolling the Selwood neighborhood on a routine night shift when he received what seemed like a standard domestic disturbance call. Unit 192. We have a noise complaint at 1247 Maple Street, dispatch had reported. Neighbors calling about loud music. Resident not responding to knocks. Webb arrived at the modest bungalow to find the complainants, an elderly couple from next door, standing on their porch in bathrobes. It's been going for 3 hours, the woman explained. Same song, over and over. We've knocked, rang the doorbell, even threw pebbles at the windows. Sarah's car is there, but she won't answer. The music was indeed loud, and Webb could hear it clearly from the street. But something about it seemed wrong. The melody was beautiful, almost hypnotic, but it had an underlying quality that made his skin crawl. It sounded like it was coming from multiple sources simultaneously, not just speakers but from the walls themselves, from the very air. "How long has Sarah lived here?" Webb asked. "About 2 years. Quiet girl, works at the radio station downtown. Never had any problems before." Webb approached the front door and knocked firmly. "Portland Police?" "Miss Davis, we need to speak with you about a noise complaint." The music continued unchanged. No response from inside. Webb tried the door handle, unlocked. Standard procedure would be to call for backup before entering, but the situation seemed relatively benign. Just a neighbor playing music too loud, probably fallen asleep or passed out. Inside, the music was deafening. But what stopped Webb cold was that it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Not from speakers or a stereo, but from the walls, the ceiling, even the floorboards. Every surface in the house was vibrating with the melody. "Sarah." "Portland Police." "Are you okay?" The living room contained normal furniture, couch, coffee table, television, but every electronic device was tuned to a different frequency, and yet all were playing the same haunting melody. The radio was tuned to 95.5 FM. The television was showing static but broadcasting music. Even Sarah's cell phone was somehow playing the same tune. Webb found Sarah Davis in her bedroom, sitting perfectly still in front of an elaborate radio setup that looked more like mission control than a hobbyist collection. Multiple transceivers, frequency scanners, signal processors, and computers filled the entire room. She sat motionless in a chair facing the equipment, her back to the door. "Sarah, can you hear me?" When she didn't respond, Webb moved around to face her. Sarah's eyes were open but completely unfocused, staring at something far beyond the wall of radio equipment. Her mouth was slightly open, and she was breathing in perfect rhythm with the music filling the house. "Sarah, I'm Officer Webb with Portland Police. I need you to respond if you can hear me." She didn't blink, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. But when Webb reached toward her shoulder to gently shake her, his radio suddenly erupted with voices. "Don't touch her." The warning came through his handheld, but it wasn't dispatch. "Officer Webb, step away from her immediately. She's tuned into something that isn't supposed to exist." Webb jerked his hand back and keyed his radio. "Dispatch, did you copy that transmission?" "Unit 192, this is dispatch. No unusual traffic on this channel. What's your status?" Before Webb could respond, his radio crackled again. "She's been pulling frequencies from beyond normal space. Every signal that passes through this house gets contaminated. If you touch her while she's connected, you'll become part of the bridge." Webb looked more carefully at Sarah's radio setup. Multiple displays showed frequency readings that made no sense, numbers far beyond the range of normal AM or FM broadcasts. Some screens showed waveforms that seemed to move independently of any signal input, as if the equipment was receiving broadcasts from empty space. "Who is this?" Webb demanded into his radio. "Identify yourself." "My name was Robert Chen. I was the first." Sarah found my frequency signature when I responded to a call here 2 weeks ago. I'm trapped between stations now, trying to warn others. Webb felt cold sweat despite the house's warmth. Officer Robert Chen had been reported missing 12 days ago. His patrol car had been found parked outside this same address, but there had been no sign of him. The department had assumed he'd abandoned his post, possibly fled the state due to personal problems. Chen's been missing for almost 2 weeks, Webb said into his radio. I know. Sarah's been using my signal as an anchor point, learning to reach further into the frequency spectrum. Every officer she takes makes her stronger. We're all connected now, all part of her expanding network. The music in the house began to change, becoming more complex, more layered. Webb realized that what he'd initially thought was one song was actually multiple melodies playing simultaneously, weaving together in impossible harmonies. What does she want? Webb asked. She discovered frequencies that exist between the normal spectrum, spaces where signals shouldn't be able to travel, but do. She's learned to tune into them, and now she's using them to pull things through from somewhere else. The missing officers aren't dead, Webb. We're being used as relay stations to amplify her signal. Webb looked at Sarah again. She hadn't moved, but he noticed now that her breathing was perfectly synchronized with the flashing lights on her radio equipment. She had become part of the machine. How do I stop her? You can't, not from here. The only way to break her connection is to destroy the source signal. But she's hidden it somewhere in the city, somewhere she can access multiple radio towers simultaneously. Webb began backing toward the door, but as he moved, every radio in the house suddenly tuned to his voice, broadcasting his location, his frequency, his fear. Sarah had locked onto his signal. Officer Webb! Her voice came through his radio, but her lips didn't move. Thank you for coming. Your frequency signature is exactly what I needed to reach the police communication network. Now I can call all of you, one by one. Webb ran for the door, but the music followed him, seeming to emanate from his own radio now. No matter how far he drove from the house, the melody continued, beautiful and terrifying, worming its way deeper into his consciousness. By morning, Webb's patrol car was found parked outside the radio station where Sarah Davis worked. He was never seen again, but his voice could be heard on police radios throughout Portland, joining the growing chorus of warnings about the frequency killer. Detective Lieutenant Monica Santos had been with the Portland Police Bureau for 22 years, long enough to recognize when individual cases were connected in ways that weren't immediately obvious. It was Santos who first noticed that all the missing officers had last been seen at locations connected to KPRL 95.5 FM. Sarah Davis worked there as a sound engineer. Officer Chen had responded to a noise complaint at her house. Officer Webb had investigated the same house 2 weeks later. Officer Martinez had been called to the radio station itself for a break-in report that turned out to be false. Officer Thompson had stopped a suspicious vehicle in the parking lot of a radio tower on Mount Scott. 5 missing officers, 5 locations connected to radio signals, and all of their voices now broadcasting warnings through police radios, claiming to be trapped between frequencies. Santos didn't believe in supernatural explanations, but she also didn't ignore patterns that defied conventional investigation. She started with Sarah Davis's employment records and found something interesting. Before Portland, Davis had worked at radio stations in 3 other cities: Phoenix, Denver, and Spokane. Each city had reported similar patterns of missing police officers before Davis left for her next job. In Phoenix, 6 officers had vanished over a 3-month period. All had been investigating incidents connected to the radio station where Davis worked. Their patrol cars were found abandoned, but the officers were never located. Denver, 4 officers, same pattern. Spokane, 3 officers. "We're not dealing with someone who just learned to do this," Santos concluded during a briefing with the remaining night shift officers. Sarah Davis has been perfecting this technique for years, moving from city to city, taking officers and getting stronger each time. Officer Amanda Clark, who had survived her encounter at the Hawthorne Bridge, provided additional details that helped Santos understand the scope of the threat. "She's not just kidnapping officers," Clark explained. "According to the voices on the radio, she's using them as some kind of relay network. Every officer she takes extends her range and her power." Santos pulled up a map of the western United States and marked Davis's previous employment locations. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Each city where Davis had worked had subsequently reported unusual radio phenomena. Dead stations broadcasting mysterious signals, emergency frequencies carrying voices of missing people, and communication systems randomly picking up conversations from empty space. "She's building something," Santos realized. "A network of missing people spread across multiple states, all connected through radio frequencies. But why?" The answer came through Clark's radio during the briefing. "Because she's trying to establish permanent contact with something that exists between frequencies." Thompson's voice crackled through the speaker. "We can see it from here, shapes moving in the static, intelligence trying to communicate through the gaps in normal space. She's creating a bridge." Santos grabbed the radio from Clark. "Thompson, this is Lieutenant Santos. What kind of intelligence? What's trying to communicate?" "Something that needs specific frequency combinations to manifest in our reality." Sarah discovered these beings accidentally while experimenting with signal processing equipment. They promised her power in exchange for helping them cross over. Cross over from where? From the spaces between radio stations. The frequencies that exist but nobody uses because they're supposed to be empty. Except they're not empty, Lieutenant. They're full of things that have been waiting for someone to tune them in. Santos felt the pieces clicking together. How many officers does she need for her network? We don't know, but she told us she's close. Portland was supposed to be her final collection point. She needed officers from a major metropolitan area to complete the network, because city police have access to more powerful communication systems. Where is she now? The KPRL broadcast tower on Mount Hood. She's using the main transmitter to amplify our signals and create the final connection. Once she succeeds, the beings from between the frequencies will be able to manifest anywhere there's a radio signal. Santos looked around the briefing room at the remaining officers. How many people do we have left on night shift? 12, Officer Valdez answered. But, Lieutenant, every time we've sent someone to investigate, they've disappeared. How do we stop her without losing more people? The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Santos studied the map again, tracing the pattern of Davis's movements across the country. Each city represented dozens of missing people, all of them potentially trapped in whatever space existed between radio frequencies. We can't approach her directly, Santos concluded, but we might be able to disrupt her signal. If she's using the Mount Hood transmitter, then cutting power to that tower should break her connection. Lieutenant, Clark interrupted. My radio's picking up something. They all listened as Sarah Davis's voice came through the speaker, clear and confident. Lieutenant Santos, I know you're planning to cut power to my transmitter, but you don't understand how this works. I don't need the tower anymore. Every radio in Portland is now part of my network. Every police radio, every car stereo, every cell phone. You've all been transmitting on my frequency since this began. Santos looked around the room in growing horror. Every officer was carrying a radio. Every police car outside was equipped with communication equipment. If Davis was telling the truth, then they were all already connected to her network. The beings I serve don't just want to cross over into your reality, Davis continued. They want to replace it, transform it into something that exists primarily in the electromagnetic spectrum, where thought and signal are the same thing. The missing officers are the first phase of this transformation. How long? Santos asked into her radio. It's already beginning. Haven't you noticed that your radios work in places where they shouldn't? That you're picking up signals from frequencies that don't exist? The boundary between realities is dissolving, Lieutenant. Soon, there won't be a difference between the space you occupy and the space between radio stations. Santos realized Davis was right. For weeks, officers had been reporting radio communications in areas with no towers, signals coming through in underground parking garages, even digital readouts showing impossible frequency numbers. They had assumed it was equipment malfunction, but it was actually reality itself becoming unstable. "What do you want from us?" Santos demanded. "Nothing anymore. You've already given me everything I needed. Every time you used your radios to investigate these incidents, you strengthened my network. Every time you tried to communicate with the missing officers, you fed more signal into my system. You helped me build the bridge without realizing it." The lights in the briefing room began to flicker, and Santos noticed that the radio equipment was displaying frequency readings that defied physics. Numbers that shouldn't exist. Signals coming from directions that had no meaning in three-dimensional space. "It's starting," Thompson's voice crackled through every radio in the room simultaneously. "We can see them coming through the static. They're not exactly hostile, but they don't understand human consciousness. To them, we're just interference that needs to be tuned out." Santos looked at her remaining officers and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Everyone, turn off your radios, remove the batteries, now." But as the officers began shutting down their equipment, they realized the signals weren't stopping. The voices continued, the music kept playing, and the impossible frequency readings remained on every screen. The radio signals were no longer coming from devices. They were coming from the air itself, from the walls, from the very molecules around them. Portland had become one giant radio receiver, and Sarah Davis had finally tuned it to the frequency of something that existed between worlds. The transformation of reality had begun. Officer David Harrison knew something was wrong with Millfield the moment he stepped out of his patrol car on that crisp November evening in 2018. The small Nebraska town of 3,200 people was too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of rural America, but the unnatural silence of a place holding its breath. Harrison had been called to Millfield to assist with what the local sheriff described as a series of unusual incidents. The drive from Lincoln had taken him through endless cornfields now harvested and bare, leaving the landscape looking skeletal in the fading light. But it wasn't until he reached the town limits that he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Every street was empty. Every house was dark, except for the glow of television screens and windows. And every person he glimpsed through those windows was sitting motionless, staring at their screens with the blank intensity of mannequins. Sheriff Tom Bradley met Harrison at the town's only diner, a place called Mel's that should have been busy during the dinner hour, but stood completely empty except for the two officers. Bradley was a 20-year veteran who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Appreciate you coming out," Bradley said, his voice hoarse. "Lincoln said you had experience with unusual cases." Harrison had indeed worked several cases that defied conventional explanation, though he'd never put it quite that way in his reports. "What kind of unusual are we talking about?" Bradley led him to a back booth and spread out a collection of photographs and police reports. started about 6 weeks ago. People began reporting that they were losing time, hours, sometimes entire days. They'd go to sleep on Tuesday and wake up on Thursday with no memory of Wednesday. Drugs, alcohol, mental health issues? That's what I thought initially. But it's affecting everyone, Officer Harrison. Everyone. Old folks, teenagers, people who've never touched a drop of alcohol in their lives. And it's getting worse. Harrison studied the photographs. They showed ordinary scenes. People at the grocery store, walking down Main Street, sitting in their cars. But something was off about the images. The people all had the same expression. Vacant, distant, as if they were sleepwalking with their eyes open. These photos were taken last week. But here's the thing. I don't remember taking them. Neither does Deputy Martinez, who's supposedly the photographer according to the timestamps. We found them on our department's computer, but neither of us has any recollection of conducting surveillance. Harrison felt a familiar chill. In his experience, when police officers started losing time, something much more serious was happening than simple memory problems. How many people are affected? Near as I can tell, everyone in town except me and Martinez. And even we're starting to have episodes. Yesterday I found myself standing in the middle of the corn maze outside of town with no memory of how I got there. I was supposed to be doing paperwork at the station. Corn maze? Yeah, that's another thing. The Hendricks family has run a corn maze every October for 15 years. Simple tourist attraction, brings in some revenue during harvest season. But this year, people keep going in and coming out. Different. Bradley showed Harrison a map of the maze, which covered nearly 20 acres of formerly productive farmland. What should have been a simple pattern of paths cut through corn stalks was instead a complex geometric design that hurt to look at directly. The design changed, Bradley explained. The Hendricks swear they cut the same pattern they've used for years, but satellite images show something completely different. And people who go through it, they come out calm, peaceful, and missing chunks of their memory. Harrison studied the aerial photograph of the maze. The pattern was hypnotic and somehow wrong, like looking at an optical illusion that made his brain itch. Anyone talk to the family about this? That's where it gets weird. The Hendricks family doesn't remember changing the design. They don't remember much of anything from the past 6 weeks. But they keep running the maze, keep taking admission fees, keep acting like everything's normal. As they talked, Harrison became aware of a low humming sound, almost below the threshold of hearing. When he mentioned it, Bradley nodded grimly. You hear it too. Started around the same time as the memory problems. Some kind of subsonic frequency. We tried to track down the source, but he gestured helplessly. But you forgot what you found? Exactly. Harrison looked out the diner's window at the empty street. A few people were visible in the distance, walking with the same mechanical gait he'd noticed in the photographs. Sheriff, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you remember calling Lincoln for assistance? Bradley's face went pale. No. I remember wanting to call, thinking about it, but I can't remember actually making the call. How did you end up here? Harrison pulled out his phone and checked his recent calls. According to his log, he'd received a call from the Millfield Sheriff's Department 3 hours ago. But when he tried to access the voicemail, he found only static. We need to leave, Harrison said quietly. Right now. But as they stood to go, Harrison realized that the humming sound was getting louder, and with it came something else. A gentle tugging sensation in his mind, like someone trying to coax a memory out of hiding. For just a moment, he found himself wondering why he was so worried about memory loss. It seemed like such a small thing, really. People forget things all the time. Maybe it would be peaceful to just let go of all those accumulated worries and fears. "Officer Harrison!" Bradley's sharp voice cut through the mental fog. "Stay with me. Don't listen to the humming." Harrison shook his head, clearing away the strange sense of contentment that had been settling over him. What the hell was that? That's how it starts. The humming gets into your head, makes you think that forgetting is better than remembering. Makes you want to give up your memories voluntarily. They hurried toward the diner's exit, but Harrison stopped when he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Through the window, he could see people emerging from houses all along Main Street. They moved in perfect synchronization, all walking toward the center of town with that same vacant expression. Where are they going? I don't know. This happens every night around this time. They all walk to the town square, stand there for about an hour, then go home. In the morning, none of them remember doing it. Harrison watched the eerie procession of zombified townspeople. "Sheriff, how long has it been since you've tried to leave Millfield?" Bradley opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, concentration, then dawning horror. I can't remember. I know I've thought about leaving, but I can't remember actually trying to do it." Harrison pulled out his phone to call for backup, but found that he had no signal. Not unusual in rural Nebraska, except that he'd had full bars when he'd arrived in town. "We need to get to my car and get out of here. Something in this town is harvesting people's memories, and I think we're about to become part of the collection." They pushed through the diner's front door, but the moment they stepped outside, the humming became exponentially louder. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a physical presence pressing against Harrison's consciousness, trying to pry open the locked doors of his mind. Images flashed through his thoughts. Memories of his childhood, his police training, cases he'd worked, people he'd loved. But the images were becoming unstuck, floating free from their context like photographs scattered by the wind. He could feel something vast and hungry examining each memory, deciding which ones to keep and which ones to discard. "The car!" Bradley gasped beside him. "We have to reach your car." But Harrison's patrol car seemed impossibly far away, even though it was parked just across the street. With each step, the humming grew stronger, and he could feel more of his memories being pulled away. His first day as a police officer, gone. His high school graduation, fading. The face of his first partner, blurring into anonymity. "It's trying to make us forget why we came here," Harrison realized. "If we can't remember that there's a problem, we can't try to solve it." They were halfway to the car when Harrison noticed that the synchronized townspeople had changed direction. Instead of walking toward the town square, they were all walking toward Harrison and Bradley. Their faces remained blank, but there was something predatory about their movement now. "They're protecting whatever's doing this to them," Bradley said. "They don't remember that they used to be different, so they think this is normal. They'll stop us from leaving because leaving means remembering." The crowd of memory-drained residents was closing in from all directions. Harrison fumbled for his keys, but found that he couldn't quite remember how to use them. The humming had grown so loud it felt like his skull might crack, and with it came a terrible understanding. He wasn't going to escape Millfield. In a few more minutes, he would forget why he'd wanted to leave in the first place. He would join the peaceful procession of people who had surrendered their pasts in exchange for an eternal, thoughtless present. But in those final moments of clarity, Harrison managed to do one thing that would eventually save not just Millfield, but dozens of other small towns across the American heartland. He activated his body camera and began recording a message. Not for backup, not for his superiors, but for himself. Because sometimes, when everything else is taken away, The only thing left to do is leave yourself a trail of breadcrumbs back to the truth. The entity that would later be identified as Subject Zero by government researchers had been refining its feeding process for nearly 70 years before it arrived in Millfield. Unlike parasites that consume blood or tissue, this organism fed exclusively on human memory. Not just the electrical patterns that stored experiences, but the emotional weight that gave those memories meaning. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist with the CDC's Special Investigations Unit, would eventually determine that Subject Zero was not originally from Earth. Her analysis of tissue samples recovered from Millfield suggested an organism that had evolved in an environment where consciousness existed independently of physical matter, a place where thoughts and memories had substance and could be consumed like nutrients. But that discovery would come later, after the full scope of the crisis became clear. In November 2018, Officer David Harrison's body camera footage was the first concrete evidence that something unprecedented was happening in rural Nebraska. The footage shows Harrison's final minutes of coherent thought as the memory-draining entity attempted to process him. More importantly, it captured his desperate attempt to document the truth before that truth could be taken away from him. My name is David Harrison, badge number 1847, Lincoln Police Department. Harrison's voice crackles through static as the camera shows him stumbling toward his patrol car. I came to Millfield to investigate reports of memory loss. The entire town is compromised. Something is feeding on people's memories, leaving them as functional but empty shells. The camera lurches as Harrison falls to his knees, the humming sound now clearly audible on the recording. Around him, the blank-faced residents of Millfield close in like antibodies attacking an infection. The source appears to be connected to the corn maze on the Hendricks property, Harrison continues, his voice becoming slurred as his cognitive functions begin to shut down. Pattern in the maze is not normal. Geometric design that shouldn't exist. People go in with memories, come out empty. What happens next in the footage would puzzle researchers for months. The camera shows Harrison collapsing completely, his body convulsing as if in the grip of a massive seizure. But the audio continues to record, and what it captures defies explanation. Instead of Harrison's voice, the camera picks up something else. A low, rhythmic pulsing that sounds almost like breathing, but impossibly vast. And underneath that sound, faintly, are voices. Hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, all whispering fragments of memories. I was 7 when my dog died. My first kiss was behind the school gymnasium. I remember the smell of my grandmother's kitchen. The day my daughter was born. The voices overlap and interweave, creating a cacophony of stolen experiences. And gradually, researchers would realize they were listening to Subject Zero's digestive process, the entity literally consuming the accumulated memories of everyone it had processed, not just in Millfield, but across decades of feeding. The footage ends abruptly when Harrison's camera stops recording, but the implications of what it captured sent shockwaves through multiple government agencies. If an organism could consume human memory on this scale, then entire populations could be compromised without anyone realizing it. Communities could be hollowed out from the inside, leaving behind perfect replicas of human society with all the substance removed. Within 48 hours of the footage being analyzed, Millfield was quietly evacuated under the cover of a chemical spill emergency. The official story spoke of contaminated groundwater that caused neurological symptoms, requiring temporary relocation while cleanup crews addressed the problem. The truth was far more complex. A joint task force of military, scientific, and law enforcement personnel descended on the town with one primary objective: understand how Subject Zero operated and determine if it could be destroyed without killing the people whose memories it had consumed. Dr. Chen led the research team that explored the Hendrix corn maze. What they found challenged every assumption about how consciousness and memory functioned. The maze wasn't simply cut into corn stalks. It was a three-dimensional structure that extended both above and below ground level. Beneath the surface, a network of tunnels had been excavated in a pattern that matched the aerial view of the maze exactly. But these tunnels predated human settlement in the area by centuries. Carbon dating of organic material found in the tunnel wall suggested the structure was at least 800 years old, possibly much older. More disturbing was the discovery that the tunnel system extended far beyond the boundaries of the Hendrix property, connecting to similar structures beneath other towns throughout Nebraska, Iowa, and Kansas. "It's like a subway system," Dr. Chen reported to the task force commander. "But instead of transporting people, it's designed to transport something else. Something that needs specific geometric patterns to move efficiently." Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the tunnel networks formed vast geometric patterns when viewed from above. Patterns that matched designs found in crop circles, ancient petroglyphs, and mathematical equations describing multidimensional space. Subject Zero wasn't just a predator that had stumbled upon Earth. It was part of an ancient system that had been harvesting human consciousness for centuries. The breakthrough in understanding came when Dr. Chen's team discovered that the stolen memories weren't simply consumed. They were being stored. Deep beneath the center of each maze was a chamber filled with what could only be described as organic computer banks. Massive growths that resembled brain coral, but pulsed with electrical activity that matched human neural patterns. "It's keeping them," Dr. Chen whispered into her radio as she explored the chamber beneath Millfield. "Every memory it takes is being preserved in these storage organs. The people aren't losing their memories permanently. They're being copied and archived. But for what purpose?" The answer came from an unexpected source, Officer David Harrison himself. 3 days after his disappearance, Harrison walked into the task force command center outside Millfield, apparently unharmed, but with no memory of the past week. His body camera was still recording. During debriefing, Harrison displayed all the symptoms of the other Millfield residents: peaceful demeanor, gaps in memory, and an unsettling lack of curiosity about his missing time. But his body camera had continued recording throughout his captivity, providing an unprecedented view of Subject Zero's operation. The footage showed Harrison being taken into the underground chamber, where he was connected to the organic storage system through tendrils that attached to his skull. But instead of simply draining his memories, the entity appeared to be downloading them while simultaneously uploading something else. "It's not just taking memories," Dr. Chen realized as she analyzed the footage. "It's replacing them with its own consciousness, creating a backup copy of itself in every person it processes." The implications were staggering. Subject Zero wasn't just feeding on human memory. It was creating an army of sleeper agents, each carrying a fragment of its consciousness that could be activated when needed. The peaceful, empty-eyed residents of Millfield weren't victims. They were incubators for an alien intelligence that was slowly replacing humanity from within. The entity's ultimate goal became clear when researchers accessed its organic computer network. The stored memories weren't random. They were specifically selected for their emotional intensity and social connections. Subject Zero was mapping human relationships, learning how to mimic love, fear, loyalty, and trust. It was preparing to perfectly impersonate key individuals in positions of power and influence. The memory banks contained detailed profiles of politicians, military officers, scientists, and law enforcement officials from across the country. Subject Zero had been studying humanity for decades, preparing for a takeover that would be so subtle that no one would realize it was happening until it was too late. But Dr. Chen also discovered something that gave her hope. The entity's storage system was vulnerable. Because it had evolved in an environment where consciousness existed independently of physical matter, Subject Zero couldn't fully understand the difference between original memories and copies. It treated both as equally real, which meant it couldn't distinguish between genuine human consciousness and artificial constructs. Working with military cyber warfare specialists, Dr. Chen developed a plan to inject false memories into Subject Zero's network. Memories that would convince the entity that it had already achieved its goals and could safely return to its home dimension. The plan was dangerous, requiring volunteers to allow themselves to be processed by the entity while carrying carefully crafted false memories. Officer David Harrison volunteered to be the primary carrier, despite having no memory of why he'd originally come to Millfield. "I may not remember what I'm fighting for," he told Dr. Chen, "but my body camera does. And according to that footage, I was trying to save people. That seems like something worth continuing." The final confrontation took place in the underground chamber, where Harrison allowed himself to be connected to Subject Zero's network one more time. As the entity began downloading his memories, it also absorbed the false experiences that Dr. Chen's team had implanted. Memories of successfully replacing key government officials, of establishing control over major population centers, of completing its mission and receiving orders to return home. Subject Zero, convinced that it had achieved total victory, began the process of withdrawing from Earth. The tunnel networks collapsed as the entity pulled its consciousness back through dimensional barriers. The organic storage banks withered and died, releasing the accumulated memories of thousands of victims back to their original owners. For the residents of Millfield and dozens of other affected communities, the return of their memories was traumatic but complete. They remembered everything that had been taken from them, including their time as unwilling hosts for an alien intelligence. The psychological impact would require years of therapy and support. Officer Harrison recovered his full memory of the investigation, but also retained some residual connection to Subject Zero's network. He could sense when new memory-feeding entities arrived on Earth, making him an invaluable early warning system for future incursions. The Millfield incident remained classified, but its impact on law enforcement was profound. Police departments across the country began training officers to recognize signs of memory manipulation and mass consciousness alteration. The official explanation spoke of chemical contamination that caused temporary neurological symptoms, but those with security clearance knew the truth. Humanity had faced its first attempt at cognitive colonization and barely survived. The entities that existed between dimensions had taken notice of Earth's consciousness-rich environment, and they would certainly try again. The only question was whether human society would be ready for the next invasion of the mind. As for the corn mazes that had served as Subject Zero's access points, they were quietly destroyed and the land converted to other uses. But sometimes, on quiet autumn evenings when the wind blows through empty fields, residents of formerly affected areas report hearing something that sounds like whispered memories carried on the breeze, fragments of stolen experiences that never quite made it home. Patrol Officer Jennifer Santos knew the children of Riverside Elementary were too quiet, but it took her 3 weeks to realize they had stopped speaking entirely. The small Colorado mountain town of Cedar Falls prided itself on its excellent schools and tight-knit community, where everyone knew everyone and children played freely in streets that rarely saw a crime more serious than the occasional DUI. It was November 2017 when Santos first noticed the change during her routine school zone patrol. The crossing guard, Mrs. Patterson, flagged her down with obvious concern etched across her weathered face. "Officer Santos, "I need to report something strange," Patterson said, glancing nervously toward the school playground where dozens of children moved through their recess activities in complete silence. "The kids, they're not talking anymore." Santos followed Patterson's gaze. The playground scene looked normal at first. Children on swings, others playing tag, small groups gathered around jungle gyms. But as she watched more carefully, she realized Patterson was right. Not a single child was speaking. They communicated through gestures and expressions, but their mouths remained closed. "When did this start?" Santos asked. "Gradually, over the past few weeks. First, it was just a few of the quieter kids, but now, well, look for yourself." Santos approached the fence surrounding the playground. The children noticed her presence and turned to look, their faces bright and seemingly happy. Several waved enthusiastically, but none called out greetings. None asked to see her patrol car. None exhibited the normal vocal curiosity of elementary school students encountering a police officer. "Have you talked to the principal about this?" "That's just it," Patterson replied with increasing worry. "Mr. Davidson says it's not a problem. Says the children are simply becoming more focused and disciplined. But Officer Santos, I've been doing this job for 15 years. Children don't just stop talking." Santos made a mental note to follow up with the school administration, but before she could respond, something happened that made her blood run cold. A soccer ball bounced over the fence and rolled toward her feet. In any normal situation, the child who had kicked it would have called out, "Sorry," or "Can you throw it back?" or at least made some sound of acknowledgement. Instead, the boy who had lost the ball simply walked to the fence and pointed at the ball, then pointed back toward the playground. When Santos picked up the ball and prepared to toss it back, the boy opened his mouth as if to say, "Thank you," but no sound came out. His lips moved, forming the words, but it was as if his voice had been stolen. The child didn't seem distressed by this inability to speak. If anything, he appeared calm and content, offering Santos a bright smile before returning to his game. But Santos noticed something else that made her skin crawl. Every other child on the playground had stopped their activities to watch the interaction. They stood perfectly still. Dozens of small faces turned toward her with identical expressions of mild curiosity. When the ball was returned, all the children simultaneously resumed their activities, moving in perfect coordination as if responding to a silent signal. Santos spent the rest of her shift thinking about what she'd witnessed. She'd worked with children in various capacities throughout her 8-year career with Cedar Falls PD, and she'd never seen anything like the eerie synchronization she'd observed at Riverside Elementary. That evening, she decided to drive through some of the residential neighborhoods where the school children lived. What she found deepened her concern. Houses that should have been filled with the sounds of family dinners, homework arguments, and television shows were silent. Completely silent. Santos parked outside the Morrison house, where she knew 3 elementary-aged children lived. Through the lit windows, she could see the family moving through their evening routine. Parents helping with homework, children setting the table, normal domestic activities. But even with her windows down and the neighborhood otherwise quiet, she couldn't hear a single voice. She walked up to the front door and knocked. Mrs. Morrison answered immediately, smiling warmly and gesturing for Santos to come inside. But when Mrs. Morrison opened her mouth to speak, no sound emerged. She appeared to be talking normally. Her lips moved. She appeared to be talking normally. Her lips moved, her facial expressions changed appropriately. Her body language suggested conversation, but she was completely mute. The 3 Morrison children gathered around, all appearing delighted to see Officer Santos. They gestured enthusiastically, pointed at her badge and utility belt, and clearly wanted to interact. but like their mother, they made no sound at all. Santos tried to communicate through writing, pulling out her notepad and pen. She wrote, "Are you feeling all right? Can you hear me?" Mrs. Morrison read the note and nodded vigorously, then took the pen and wrote back, "We feel wonderful. The children are so well behaved now. No arguing, no noise complaints from neighbors. It's been very peaceful." "When did you stop being able to speak?" Santos wrote. Mrs. Morrison looked confused by the question. She wrote, "We can speak fine. We just choose not to. It's much better this way." Santos felt ice forming in her stomach. Mrs. Morrison genuinely believed she was speaking normally. To her, the complete absence of sound was not a problem, but an improvement. Santos wrote, "I need to speak with your husband." Mr. Morrison emerged from the kitchen, and the same pattern repeated. He appeared to greet Santos enthusiastically, moving his lips in what seemed like normal conversation, but producing no sound. When presented with the notepad, he wrote, "Officer Santos, good to see you. The kids wanted to show you their project from school." The children led Santos to the living room, where they had constructed an elaborate model city from cardboard and clay. It was impressive work, clearly requiring significant collaboration and planning. But as Santos watched them explain their creation, moving their mouths animatedly and pointing to different sections of the model, the complete silence became overwhelming. She wrote, "This is beautiful. How did you coordinate building it without talking?" The oldest Morrison child, a 10-year-old girl named Emma, took the pen and wrote, "We don't need to talk anymore. We understand each other perfectly now. It's much quieter in our heads." That phrase, "quieter in our heads," stuck with Santos as she left the Morrison house. She drove through several more neighborhoods and confirmed that the silence had spread throughout Cedar Falls. Not just the children, but entire families had stopped speaking, continued their normal activities, appeared happy and healthy, but existed in a bubble of complete vocal silence. Santos returned to the police station and found that Chief Williams working late in his office. She knocked on his door and was surprised when he gestured for her to enter without speaking. Chief Williams appeared pleased to see her, pointing to a chair and moving his lips in what seemed like a greeting, but making no sound. "Chief?" Santos said aloud. "Chief Williams, can you hear me?" Williams looked puzzled by her question. He picked up a pen and wrote, "Of course I can hear you, Santos. Though I have to say, you're being quite loud. Most of us have found it more peaceful to communicate quietly." Santos realized with growing horror that Chief Williams, like the Morrison family, believed he was speaking normally. To him, complete silence was quiet communication. She wrote, "Chief, I think we have a serious problem. People throughout Cedar Falls have stopped speaking, but they don't realize it." Williams read the note and wrote back, "I disagree. The community has simply evolved past the need for loud, disruptive, verbal communication. Crime is down, domestic disturbances have eliminated entirely, and citizen complaints have dropped to zero. This is the most peaceful the town has ever been." Santos stared at his response. Chief Williams wasn't wrong about the crime statistics. She'd noticed the unusual quiet on the police radio over the past few weeks. But she was beginning to understand that the silence wasn't a symptom of peace. It was the cause of it. Something was suppressing not just people's ability to speak, but their recognition that anything was wrong. She wrote, "Chief, I think I may be the only person in town who still has their voice. I need to investigate what's causing this." Williams looked at her with something approaching pity. He wrote, "Santos, you've always been one of our more energetic officers. Perhaps you should consider trying the quiet approach. You might find it reduces your stress levels significantly." Santos left the station feeling more isolated than she'd ever felt in her life. She was surrounded by people she'd known for years, people who appeared happy and functional, but who had been robbed of one of the most fundamental aspects of human communication without even realizing it. She drove to the edge of town, where cell phone reception was strongest, and called the state police. But when Sergeant Martinez answered, Santos made a chilling discovery. "Colorado State Police, this is Sergeant Martinez." "Sergeant, this is Officer Santos with Cedar Falls PD. I need to report a unusual situation." "I'm sorry, Officer Santos, but you're cutting out badly. I can barely hear you. Are you using a defective radio?" Santos looked at her phone. Full signal strength, clear connection. But somehow, her voice wasn't transmitting properly. "Can you hear me now?" she said, speaking as loudly as she could. "Officer Santos, I'm getting very faint audio. It sounds like you are whispering from a great distance. You'll need to call back when you have a better connection." The line went dead. Santos tried calling again, with the same result. Her voice, clear and strong to her own ears, was apparently coming through as barely audible whispers to anyone outside Cedar Falls. She was trapped in a town where everyone had lost their voices but didn't know it, and her own voice was being suppressed when she tried to call for help. Whatever was causing the silence was also preventing her from reporting it to outside authorities. Santos drove back into town, her mind racing through possible explanations. Chemical contamination that affected vocal cords? Some kind of mass psychosis? A neurological virus that disrupted speech centers in the brain? But none of those theories explained why people didn't realize they couldn't speak, or why they seemed genuinely happier in their silent state. As she passed Riverside Elementary again, Santos noticed that lights were on in the building despite the late hour. She parked and tried the front door, finding it unlocked. Inside, she could hear the sound of construction. Hammering, drilling, the movement of heavy objects. Following the noise, she found herself in the school's basement, where a renovation project appeared to be underway. But this wasn't normal construction. The basement was being converted into something that looked more like a laboratory or medical facility. Strange equipment lined the walls, and geometric patterns had been painted on the floor in what appeared to be phosphorescent paint. Working on the project were several adults she recognized from around town, including Principal Davidson and Mrs. Patterson, the crossing guard who had first expressed concern about the silent children. They worked in perfect coordination, communicating through gestures and facial expressions but making no sound at all. When they noticed Santos, they all stopped working and turned toward her with identical expressions of mild surprise. Principal Davidson approached, smiling warmly, and gestured for her to follow him deeper into the basement. In the back corner of the renovation area, Santos found something that made her understand the true scope of what was happening in Cedar Falls. A large tank filled with what appeared to be water, but which moved with an oily, iridescent quality that suggested it wasn't water at all. Suspended in the liquid was something organic, a mass of tissue that pulsed rhythmically and seemed to be connected to the building's electrical system through a network of cables. Principal Davidson pointed proudly at the tank and moved his lips in what was clearly an explanation of the project. His face showed enthusiasm and satisfaction as he gestured toward the organic mass. But of course, Santos couldn't hear a word he was saying. She pulled out her notepad and wrote, "What is that thing?" Davidson took the pen and wrote, "It's beautiful, isn't it? We found it 6 weeks ago when we were installing new plumbing. It had been waiting down here for someone to discover it. It teaches us how to communicate without all the noise and chaos of the voices. Where did it come from? We don't know, but it doesn't matter. What matters is how much better everything is now. No more arguments, no more loud children disrupting classes, no more family fights keeping neighbors awake. Perfect peace." Santos stared at the pulsing mass in the tank. It was definitely alive, and somehow it was responsible for the silence that had consumed Cedar Falls. But unlike the supernatural entities she'd read about in case files from other jurisdictions, this thing didn't seem malevolent. If anything, it appeared to be offering the town exactly what Davidson described: perfect peace through the elimination of vocal communication. She wrote, "Principal Davidson, don't you miss being able to talk? Don't you miss hearing your students' voices?" Davidson considered the question seriously, then wrote, "At first, yes. But now I realize how much noise and conflict comes from speaking. The children are learning faster now that they're not distracted by chatter. Families are closer because they have to really pay attention to each other's nonverbal communication. It's an improvement." Santos looked around at the other adults working on the basement project. They all appeared content, focused, and cooperative. There was no denying that they seemed genuinely happier than she'd ever seen them. But she also realized that something fundamental was being lost. Human language wasn't just noise. It was the foundation of complex thought, creativity, and emotional expression. By taking away people's voices, the entity in the tank was also taking away essential parts of their humanity. She wrote, "What happens when someone visits Cedar Falls from outside? Won't they notice that no one can speak?" Davidson's response chilled her. "We've been working on that problem. The entity is learning to extend its influence beyond the town limits. Soon, visitors will experience the same peaceful silence we enjoy. Eventually, everyone will understand the benefits of quiet communication." Santos realized she was witnessing the early stages of something that could spread far beyond Cedar Falls. The entity wasn't just affecting the town, it was preparing to expand its influence, potentially consuming entire regions in silence. She needed to find a way to stop it, but she was one person against an entire community that genuinely believed they were experiencing an improvement in their quality of life. They wouldn't help her destroy something they saw as beneficial. As she pondered her options, Santos noticed that her own voice was becoming harder to produce. The words felt thick in her throat, and she had to concentrate to make sounds. The entity's influence was beginning to affect her as well. She had perhaps hours before she would lose her voice entirely, and, like everyone else in Cedar Falls, forget that anything was wrong. The question was whether she could find a way to destroy the entity before she became another contented, silent member of the community. But as Santos looked at the peaceful faces of the adults working around her, she found herself wondering, was she trying to save Cedar Falls, or was she trying to destroy something that had genuinely made people happier? The entity pulsed gently in its tank, and for just a moment Santos thought she could hear something. Not a voice, but a feeling transmitted directly into her mind. It felt like contentment, like the deep satisfaction of finally being free from noise and chaos and conflict. Maybe, she thought, just maybe, silence really was better. Officer Jennifer Santos had been thinking in progressively shorter sentences for the past hour, and she was beginning to understand why. The entity in the basement of Riverside Elementary wasn't just stealing voices. It was rewiring the neural pathways that connected thought to language. As people lost their ability to speak, they also gradually lost their ability to think in words. The realization came to her as she watched Principal Davidson and the other adults working on the basement project. Their movements were becoming more fluid, more coordinated, but also less individually purposeful. They were starting to function more like parts of a single organism than like separate people making individual decisions. Santos forced herself to think in complete sentences, using her internal voice to maintain the mental structures that the entity was trying to dissolve. She wrote in her notepad, How long before people lose the ability to think in language entirely? Davidson read her question and paused in his work. When he wrote his response, Santos noticed that his handwriting was simpler than it had been earlier, his vocabulary more limited. Thinking in words is noisy. Better to think in feelings and pictures, cleaner, peaceful. Santos understood now why Chief Williams and the Morrison family believed they were still speaking normally. As their ability to process language deteriorated, they were losing the cognitive framework necessary to recognize that they'd lost their voices. The entity wasn't just creating physical silence, it was creating mental silence, a state where the concept of vocal communication gradually became meaningless. But there was something else happening that Santos found even more disturbing. As she watched the adults work, she noticed that they were beginning to anticipate each other's actions in ways that suggested shared consciousness. They reached for tools before their colleagues indicated they needed them, moved to assist with tasks before being asked, and coordinated complex activities without any visible communication at all. The entity wasn't just stealing individual voices, it was building a collective mind. Santos wrote, "Are you sharing thoughts with each other?" Davidson smiled when he read the question, his expression showing the kind of satisfaction someone might feel when asked about a new skill they'd mastered. He wrote, "We understand each other perfectly now. No misunderstandings, no conflicts. We know what needs to be done and we do it together." Santos realized that she was witnessing something unprecedented, the voluntary absorption of human consciousness into a hive mind. The people of Cedar Falls weren't being coerced or controlled in any traditional sense. They were willingly surrendering their individual thoughts because the collective consciousness felt better than the isolation and conflict of separate minds. She wrote, "Don't you miss being yourself?" Davidson considered this question for a long time before responding. "I am still myself, but I am also part of something larger, like a voice in a choir, more beautiful than singing alone." Santos found herself struggling to maintain her sense of alarm about what was happening. The entity's influence was growing stronger, and she was beginning to feel the appeal of the collective consciousness. Her thoughts were becoming clearer, less cluttered with doubt and anxiety. Her concerns about losing her individuality seemed increasingly trivial compared to the peace and certainty of shared purpose. She forced herself to remember why she'd become a police officer in the first place: to protect people, even from things they might want but which would ultimately harm them. The entity might be offering peace and cooperation, but it was also erasing the diversity of thought and experience that made humanity valuable. Santos wrote, "I need to leave town to report this situation." When Davidson read her note, his expression changed. For the first time since she'd arrived in the basement, she saw something that looked like concern cross his face. He wrote, "That would be very disruptive. Outside, people don't understand the improvements we've made. They would try to interfere. What if I promised not to interfere? What if I just went home and forgot about this?" "You can't forget about this," Davidson wrote. "You've seen too much, but that's okay. You'll understand soon. The quiet is already beginning to work on you." Santos realized he was right. Her internal monologue, which she'd been fighting to maintain, was becoming more difficult to sustain. Her thoughts were increasingly composed of images and emotions rather than words, and she had to admit it felt good. The constant chatter of verbal thinking, the endless loop of worries and plans and judgments, was fading into blessed silence. She looked at the entity pulsing in its tank and felt a moment of genuine gratitude. It wasn't malevolent. It was offering humanity something it didn't even know it wanted: freedom from the noise of individual consciousness, the burden of separate thought, the loneliness of being trapped inside a single mind. But as Santos felt herself beginning to surrender to the collective consciousness, a fragment of her police training kicked in. She'd been taught to recognize when victims of psychological manipulation began to identify with their captors, and she realized that's exactly what was happening to her. The entity was offering something that felt good, but which would ultimately destroy everything that made humans human. With enormous effort, Santos forced herself to think a complete sentence. I am Officer Jennifer Santos, and I have a responsibility to protect people from threats they don't understand. The mental effort required to form that thought was exhausting, but it cleared her head enough to understand what she needed to do. The entity was vulnerable to disruption because it relied on electrical connections to maintain its influence. If she could overload the system, she might be able to break its hold on the people of Cedar Falls long enough for them to remember who they used to be. Santos wrote, I want to help with the project. What can I do? Davidson's face lit up with satisfaction. He wrote, the entity needs more electrical power to extend its influence beyond the town. We're connecting it to the main power grid. You can help us run cables from the electrical room. Perfect. Santos smiled and nodded, trying to project the same contented cooperation she saw in the others. Davidson led her to the electrical room, where several people were working to connect the entity's organic mass to the school's power system. Santos pretended to help with the cable installation while actually identifying the main power feeds. The school was connected to a significant portion of Cedar Falls' electrical grid. If she could cause a massive power surge through the system, it might overload the entity's nervous system and disrupt its influence. The challenge was creating the surge without permanently damaging the entity. Santos had no way of knowing whether the people of Cedar Falls could recover their individual consciousness if the entity died, or whether their minds had become so integrated with the collective that destroying it would leave them in vegetative states. She needed to create a controlled disruption, enough to break the entity's hold temporarily but not enough to kill it. Santos identified the main electrical panel and began planning her move. She would need to cause multiple circuit breakers to trip simultaneously while also creating a feedback loop that would send excess current directly into the entity's tank. If her timing was right, the electrical shock would force the entity to withdraw its influence, giving the people of Cedar Falls a chance to remember what they'd lost. But as she prepared to act, Santos realized that she was making a choice for an entire community. The people she was trying to save genuinely preferred their current state. They were happier, more peaceful, and more cooperative than they'd ever been. By disrupting the entity's influence, she would be forcing them back into a world of conflict, anxiety, and isolation. Was she really protecting them, or was she imposing her own values on people who had found a better way to live? Santos looked around at the contented faces of the people working in the basement. They moved with purpose and coordination, free from the petty conflicts and misunderstandings that plagued normal human interaction. They had achieved something that philosophers and social reformers had dreamed about for centuries: true cooperation and understanding. But they had achieved it by giving up the very thing that made them human, their individual voices. Santos made her choice. She grabbed the main electrical feed and jammed it directly into the entity's tank. The resulting explosion of sparks and electrical discharge sent everyone in the basement scrambling for cover. The entity convulsed violently in its tank, its bioluminescent patterns flashing in chaotic sequences. The building's power fluctuated wildly, lights flickering throughout the school, and then, suddenly, the basement filled with sound. "What happened?" Principal Davidson cried out, his voice hoarse from weeks of disuse. "Officer Santos, are you all right?" Around the basement, people were looking at each other in confusion and growing horror as they remembered what they'd lost and what they'd been doing while under the entity's influence. "Oh God," Mrs. Patterson whispered, staring at the tank containing the now dormant entity. What were we thinking? What did we do to the children? Santos helped Davidson to his feet, noting that his eyes had regained the spark of individual consciousness that had been missing for weeks. It offered you something that felt better than what you had, she said, but it would have cost you everything that makes you human. The entity wasn't dead. Santos could see that it was still alive but unconscious in its tank. The electrical shock had forced it into a dormant state, breaking its psychic hold on the town but leaving it intact. The question now was what to do with a creature that could offer humanity perfect peace at the cost of individual consciousness. As emergency services arrived to help with the aftermath, Santos found herself wondering whether she'd made the right choice. Cedar Falls was already returning to its normal pattern of human noise and conflict. Children arguing on playgrounds, parents disagreeing about homework, neighbors complaining about loud music. But they were also talking, laughing, singing, and expressing the full range of human emotion through the gift of language. They were beautifully, chaotically, individually human again. The entity remained in government custody, studied by researchers who hoped to understand how it created collective consciousness without destroying it. Some theorists suggested that humanity might eventually learn to voluntarily achieve the cooperation the entity offered while maintaining individual thought and speech. For Officer Santos, the case served as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats were those that offered genuine benefits at hidden costs. The entity hadn't been evil. It had simply existed in a way that was fundamentally incompatible with human nature. Years later, Santos would sometimes catch herself wondering what might have happened if she'd made a different choice that night in the basement. But then, she would hear children laughing and arguing on the playground, couples discussing their dreams and fears, friends sharing stories and jokes, and she would remember why voices matter. Silence might be peaceful, but it's in the noise of human conversation that civilization finds its heart. Officer Marcus Rivera thought he was losing his mind when his own shadow started moving independently on that rain-soaked Thursday evening in Phoenix, Arizona. It was March 2020, and the desert city was experiencing an unusual cold snap that had driven most residents indoors, leaving the normally bustling streets eerily empty. Rivera was conducting a routine patrol through the Maryvale district when he stopped at a red light and happened to glance at his side mirror. In the reflection, he could see his shadow cast by the streetlight behind his patrol car. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. While Rivera sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, his shadow was turning its head, looking around as if surveying the empty intersection. Rivera jerked his head around to look directly at the pavement, but from this angle, he could only see the normal shadow of his patrol car. When he looked back at the mirror, his shadow appeared normal again, mimicking his movements exactly as it should. "Jesus," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I need more sleep." But as Rivera drove through his patrol route that night, he became increasingly aware of his shadow's behavior. In windows, in puddles, in any reflective surface, he could catch glimpses of his shadow acting independently, gesturing, pointing, sometimes appearing to interact with other shadows that belonged to people who weren't there. At first, Rivera convinced himself it was fatigue-induced hallucinations. He'd been working overtime shifts for 3 weeks straight, covering for officers who were out sick. Sleep deprivation could cause visual disturbances, couldn't it? But then he noticed that his shadow wasn't just moving randomly. It was trying to communicate with him. While Rivera was parked outside a convenience store writing a traffic report, he saw his shadow in the store's front window pointing urgently toward an alley across the street. The shadow's gestures were frantic, insistent, as if trying to warn Rivera about something. Against his better judgment, Rivera decided to investigate the alley. What he found there changed everything he thought he knew about reality. 3 bodies were stacked behind a dumpster, partially concealed by tarps and construction debris. All 3 were young women. All appeared to have been killed recently, and all showed signs of a struggle. This was clearly a crime scene, but there was no way Rivera should have known to look here without his shadow's guidance. As Rivera called for backup and secured the scene, he tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe he'd subconsciously noticed something suspicious about the alley during previous patrols. Maybe his mind had processed clues that his conscious awareness had missed. But deep down, Rivera knew the truth. His shadow had led him to a serial killer's disposal site. Detective Sarah Chen arrived within 20 minutes, along with the crime scene unit. Chen was a 15-year veteran who had worked dozens of homicide cases, and she immediately recognized the signature of what appeared to be an organized serial killer. "How did you know to check this alley?" Chen asked as photographers documented the scene. Rivera hesitated. "I noticed some unusual activity in the area. Thought it was worth investigating." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. How could he explain that his shadow had pointed out the location? As the investigation proceeded, Rivera learned that the 3 victims had all disappeared over the past month from different parts of Phoenix. All were in their 20s, all lived alone, and all had last been seen leaving work or social events in the evening hours. What troubled Rivera most was that there had been no missing person reports filed for any of the victims. Their absences had gone unnoticed by family, friends, and employers, as if they had been specifically chosen for their isolation and lack of strong social connections. The investigation hit a wall almost immediately. No witnesses, no surveillance footage, no physical evidence that pointed to a specific suspect. The killer had been methodical and careful, leaving behind bodies but no clues. But Rivera's shadow had other ideas. Over the next week, Rivera's shadow began directing him to other locations throughout Phoenix. An abandoned warehouse where he found evidence of where the victims had been held. A drainage canal where he discovered personal belongings that had been dumped. A parking garage where tire tracks suggested the killer's vehicle. Each discovery advanced the investigation, but also deepened Rivera's confusion about what was happening to him. His shadow seemed to have knowledge that he didn't possess, information about crimes that defied normal police work. Detective Chen began to notice Rivera's uncanny ability to find evidence. "You've got good instincts, Rivera," she said after he led them to the 4th significant clue. "Ever think about applying for detective training?" Rivera appreciated the compliment, but he was becoming increasingly disturbed by his shadow's behavior. It wasn't just helping with the investigation anymore, it was acting independently in ways that suggested it had its own agenda. During a stakeout outside a potential suspect's apartment, Rivera watched in horror as his shadow, visible in a storefront window, appeared to be strangling another shadow that belonged to no one Rivera could see. The shadow struggle continued for several minutes before Rivera's shadow finally released its victim and turned toward Rivera with what appeared to be a satisfied gesture. That same night, the investigation's primary suspect was found dead in his apartment, apparently from a heart attack. But the man's shadow, permanently burned into the wall behind where he had been sitting, showed clear signs of strangulation marks around the neck area. Rivera began to understand that his shadow wasn't just observing crimes. It was participating in some parallel version of reality where shadows could interact, fight, and apparently kill each other. The breakthrough in the case came when Rivera's shadow led him to a small house in the suburbs where the serial killer was preparing to claim his next victim. Rivera arrived to find a man named Thomas Garrett in the process of restraining a young woman in his garage. But as Rivera called for backup and moved to arrest Garrett, something extraordinary happened. Garrett's shadow, visible on the garage wall, suddenly broke free from Garrett's body and began attacking Rivera's shadow. The two shadows fought violently while their owners faced each other in the physical world. Rivera could feel the shadow battle as if it were happening to his own body. Phantom punches, an ethereal grip around his throat, the sensation of being thrown against invisible walls. He struggled to maintain focus on arresting Garrett while simultaneously fighting for his life in a dimension he didn't understand. The shadow fight ended abruptly when Rivera's shadow gained the upper hand and appeared to tear Garrett's shadow completely away from his body. In the physical world, Garrett collapsed to the floor, alive but somehow diminished, his eyes vacant and staring. When backup arrived, they found Rivera standing over an unconscious Garrett and a terrified but unharmed potential victim. Garrett was alive but appeared to be in a catatonic state, unresponsive to questions or stimuli. "What happened here?" Detective Chen asked as paramedics loaded Garrett into an ambulance. "He collapsed when I moved to arrest him," Rivera said, which was technically true. Maybe a stroke or a seizure. But Rivera knew the real explanation. His shadow had somehow severed Garrett's connection to his own shadow, leaving behind a human shell without the dark impulses that had driven him to kill. Medical examination of Garrett revealed no physical cause for his condition. Brain scans showed normal activity, but he remained completely unresponsive. Psychiatrists described his state as profound dissociation, as if some essential part of his personality had simply vanished. But in Garrett's garage, investigators found evidence linking him to not just the 3 recent murders, but to 17 additional victims over the past 5 years. DNA evidence, personal belongings, and detailed journals documenting his crimes provided conclusive proof that Garrett was responsible for one of the largest serial killing sprees in Phoenix history. The case was closed, Garrett was institutionalized, and Rivera was commended for his investigative work. But Rivera continued to struggle with questions about what had really happened. His shadow still moved independently, but its behavior had changed. Instead of the frantic pointing and gesturing that had characterized the investigation, it now seemed calm, almost protective. Rivera began to suspect that his shadow was some kind of guardian entity that existed specifically to combat the shadows of people who committed evil acts. Further research into similar cases led Rivera to a disturbing pattern. Throughout history, there had been reports of police officers, detectives, and other law enforcement personnel who seemed to have supernatural abilities to solve crimes. Often, these individuals reported unusual dreams, visions, or inexplicable knowledge about criminal activities. Rivera found an account from a detective in the 1920s Chicago who claimed his reflection could show him scenes of crimes before they happened. A sheriff in 1950s Texas reported that his shadow would physically restrain him when he was about to walk into dangerous situations. A police captain in the 1970s New York described conversations with his own reflection that provided insights into unsolved cases. All of these officers had one thing in common. They had encountered and stopped serial killers or mass murderers, and their supernatural experiences had begun shortly before these encounters. Rivera began to theorize that there was some kind of supernatural law enforcement system that operated parallel to human police work. Just as regular officers dealt with crime in the physical world, these shadow entities dealt with the spiritual or psychological manifestations of evil that accompanied certain types of criminals. His theory was tested 6 months later, when Rivera's shadow again began exhibiting urgent behavior, pointing toward specific locations and appearing agitated during routine patrols. Following his shadow's guidance, Rivera uncovered a human trafficking operation that had been using Phoenix as a hub for moving victims across the southwestern United States. But this time, Rivera was prepared for what happened when he confronted the criminals. As he moved to arrest the trafficking ring's leader, he could see the shadow battle taking place on the walls around him. His shadow fought with multiple other shadows, engaging in combat that looked like a martial arts movie played out in silhouette. When the fight ended, the trafficking leader and his associates were all alive, but appeared to have suffered the same type of dissociation that had affected Garrett. They could walk and respond to basic commands, but the malevolent intelligence that had driven their criminal activities was gone. Rivera realized that his shadow was part of a supernatural justice system that didn't just capture criminals. It removed the evil aspects of their personalities, leaving behind people who were no longer capable of committing heinous acts. But this system came with a price. Rivera found that each shadow battle left him increasingly detached from his own emotions. The part of his consciousness that connected to his shadow was growing stronger, while his normal human personality was becoming more distant. He began to understand that officers like him were chosen not just to fight supernatural crime, but to eventually become permanent guardians in the shadow realm. The more they used their abilities, the more they became part of that parallel world of shadows and reflections. Rivera faced a choice. He could continue using his shadow's abilities to stop criminals who operated beyond the reach of normal law enforcement, knowing that he would gradually lose his humanity in the process. Or he could try to sever his connection to the shadow realm and return to being a regular police officer, but leave the supernatural criminals free to continue their activities. As Rivera considered his options, his shadow turned toward him and, for the first time, appeared to speak directly to him. Not through sound, but through a communication that bypassed his ears and went straight to his consciousness. "The choice is not yours to make," his shadow seemed to say. "You have seen too much, stopped too many. You are already more shadow than man. But this is not a curse, it is an honor. You join the ranks of those who guard the boundaries between good and evil." Rivera looked down at his hands and realized his shadow was right. In sunlight, his physical form cast only the faintest shadow, while in darkness, his shadow was solid and substantial. He was becoming a guardian, a supernatural police officer whose jurisdiction extended into realms where regular law enforcement could never reach. The transformation was irreversible, but Rivera found he didn't mind. He had found his true calling, protecting innocent people from predators who operated in the spaces between light and dark, reality and nightmare. His last entry in his regular police log read, "Transfer requested to special assignment. Will continue patrol duties in new capacity." Rivera's colleagues assumed he had been recruited for undercover work or federal task force assignment. They never suspected that he now patrolled the shadow realm, hunting criminals whose evil was so profound it cast its own darkness. On quiet nights in Phoenix, people sometimes report seeing a police officer's shadow moving independently of any visible person, investigating dark alleys and abandoned buildings where no regular patrol would venture. The shadow is always alone, always vigilant, and always hunting for the kinds of monsters that hide in the spaces between light and dark. Officer Marcus Rivera had become something more than human, something less than human, but exactly what was needed to maintain the balance between good and evil in a world where shadows could kill and darkness had its own agenda. Officer Lisa Chen was already living her third Tuesday when she realized something was wrong with October 15th, 2019. The first time through, she'd responded to a domestic disturbance call in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood, talked down an agitated husband, filed a report, and finished her shift without incident. The second time through, she'd experienced the exact same events with growing déjà vu, assuming stress was affecting her memory. But when Chen's alarm clock rang at 6 a.m. for what felt like the fourth time this week, and her radio announced the same traffic report about a fender bender on I-5, and her partner Rodriguez made the identical joke about the dispatcher's new haircut, she knew she was trapped in some kind of temporal anomaly. The domestic disturbance call came through at exactly 2:17 p.m., just as it had the previous 3 times. Same address, same situation, same resolution. But this time, Chen decided to investigate further. The call took her to a modest apartment building where Janet Harrison, 34, was having an increasingly agitated argument with her boyfriend Marcus Webb about his alleged gambling addiction. By the time Chen and Rodriguez arrived, Webb was threatening to leave permanently, while Harrison was trying to physically prevent him from packing his belongings. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and let me talk to him," Chen said, following the same script that had worked the previous 3 times. But instead of complying, Harrison turned toward Chen with wild eyes. "Officer, you have to help me. Today is the day he dies. Today is always the day he dies. I've watched it happen 6 times now." Chen felt ice in her veins. Harrison was also aware of the time loop. "What do you mean, the day he dies?" "At 4:23 this afternoon, Marcus gets hit by a drunk driver 3 blocks from here. I've tried everything, hiding his keys, calling in sick to work so he stays home, even having him arrested for disturbing the peace. But somehow, he always ends up at that intersection at exactly 4:23. Chen looked at her watch, 2:31 p.m. If Harrison was right, they had less than 2 hours to prevent a death that had already happened multiple times. "How many times have you lived this day?" Chen asked. "7, counting today. You're the first person who's believed me. Everyone else thinks I'm having a psychotic episode." Chen turned to Rodriguez, who was looking between the 2 women with obvious concern. "Rodriguez, what time is it?" 2:32. Why? What day is it?" "Tuesday, October 15th. Chen, are you feeling all right?" Rodriguez wasn't experiencing the time loop. Only Chen and Harrison were aware that they were reliving the same day repeatedly. Chen made a decision. "Ma'am, I'm going to take your concerns seriously. Can you tell me exactly what happens that leads to Mr. Webb's death?" Harrison's relief was palpable. "After you leave, Marcus goes to the downtown athletic club to work out. He always leaves at 3:45. He takes Pierce Street to avoid traffic, and at 4:23, he's crossing the intersection at Pier and Madison when a blue Honda Civic runs the red light and hits him. Do you know who's driving the Honda? A woman named Sarah Mitchell. She's drunk, celebrating a promotion at work. She gets arrested at the scene, but Marcus is already dead." Chen checked her notepad from previous iterations of this day. Sure enough, she had responding to a fatal pedestrian accident at Pier and Madison at 4:23 p.m., involving a blue Honda Civic driven by Sarah Mitchell, age 29, blood alcohol level .18. But she had no memory of the victim being Marcus Webb. In her previous experiences of this day, the victim had been an unidentified homeless man. Miss Harrison, in previous versions of this day, who was the victim of the accident? Different people each time. First it was Marcus, then a homeless man named Jerry, then a teenager named Amanda, then an elderly woman named Dorothy. The driver and the time are always the same, but the victim changes. Chen realized they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple time loop. Someone or something was manipulating events to ensure that a fatal accident occurred at that specific time and place. But the identity of the victim was somehow variable. "Rodriguez, I need you to call dispatch and request units to monitor the intersection of Pier and Madison around 4:20 p.m. possible DUI situation. Based on what probable cause? Chen couldn't explain the time loop to Rodriguez without sounding mentally unstable. Anonymous tip about erratic driving in the area. As Rodriguez called in the request, Chen turned back to Harrison. I need to understand how this loop works. Do you remember anything different about the first time you lived this day? It started normally, but around 1 p.m. I got a phone call from someone claiming to work for the city. They said there had been a water main break, and we needed to evacuate the building temporarily. We went to stay at Marcus's gym until the repairs were finished. And that's when you first witnessed the accident? Yes. We were walking back from the gym when we saw it happen. But when I woke up the next morning, it was this morning again. Same date, same time, same events. Chen was beginning to see a pattern. The time loop might be centered around preventing witnesses to something much larger than a single traffic accident. Ms. Harrison, on subsequent loops, did you always get the evacuation phone call? No, that only happened the first time. After that, I knew not to leave the apartment. But the accident still happens, just with different victims. Chen realized that the entity controlling the time loop was adapting its strategy based on their knowledge. When Harrison stopped leaving the apartment, it selected different victims to maintain the fatal accident at the predetermined time. We need to figure out why that specific intersection is important, Chen said. What happens at Pier and Madison that someone wants to cover up with a fatal accident? They had 30 minutes before Marcus Webb typically left for the gym. Chen decided to use that time to investigate the intersection area, looking for anything that might explain why a supernatural entity would arrange for repeated fatal accidents at that location. Chen drove to Pier and Madison, parking where she could observe the intersection. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical Seattle street corner. Moderate traffic, a few small businesses, pedestrian crosswalks. Nothing obviously significant. But as Chen studied the area more carefully, she noticed something strange. One of the buildings facing the intersection had no visible business signs, no customers entering or leaving, and windows that appeared to be tinted far darker than city regulations typically allowed. Chen approached the building and found that the front door was locked, but a small placard beside the entrance read, Meridian Research Associates, by appointment only. A quick check of business records on her patrol car computer revealed that Meridian Research Associates was a shell company with no listed employees, no business license on file, and ownership traced to a series of offshore corporations that led nowhere. But the building itself was clearly active. Chen could see light through the tinted windows, and there were several expensive cars parked in the building's small lot. Chen called dispatch. I need a background check on Meridian Research Associates, 1247 Madison Street. Stand by, Unit 47. While waiting for the information, Chen noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through a gap in the building's window tinting, she could see what appeared to be a large screen displaying real-time traffic camera feeds from the intersection of Pier and Madison. Someone inside the building was monitoring the exact location where the fatal accidents occurred. Unit 47, dispatch here. No records found for Meridian Research Associates. Building permits show it as vacant commercial space. Hasn't had a legitimate business tenant in over 2 years. Chen realized she had found the source of the time loop. Whatever was operating out of the supposedly vacant building was orchestrating the repeated fatal accidents, probably to prevent witnesses from observing their activities. But she was running out of time. Marcus Webb would be leaving for the gym in 15 minutes, and Sarah Mitchell would begin drinking at her promotion celebration in 20 minutes. Chen called Rodriguez. I need backup at 1247 Madison Street. Possible illegal surveillance operation. Chen, where are you? You're supposed to be following up on the domestic call. The domestic situation led to a larger investigation. Just meet me at Madison and Pier, and bring whatever units you can spare. Chen positioned herself where she could observe both the mysterious building and the intersection. At exactly 3:45 p.m., she saw Marcus Webb leave the downtown athletic club and begin walking toward the intersection, just as Harrison had predicted. At the same time, Chen spotted a blue Honda Civic with a female driver approaching from the opposite direction. The car was weaving slightly, suggesting the driver was already impaired. Chen had perhaps 3 minutes to prevent the accident and simultaneously investigate whatever was happening in the building that was worth killing people to protect. She made a split-second decision. Instead of intercepting either Webb or the drunk driver, Chen approached the building's entrance and tried the door. To her surprise, it opened easily, as if someone inside wanted her to enter. The interior of the building was nothing like the vacant commercial space it was supposed to be. Instead, Chen found herself in a sophisticated command center filled with monitors, computers, and communication equipment. The walls were covered with surveillance feeds from cameras throughout Seattle, and multiple screens showed detailed tracking information for dozens of individuals around the city. But what stopped Chen cold was a large digital display showing a countdown timer. 2 minutes, 17 seconds. Below the timer was a list of names, including Marcus Webb, and the notation, Iteration 7, Subject Awareness High, Termination Required. "Officer Chen," a voice said behind her. "We've been expecting you." Chen turned to find a woman in a business suit approximately 40 years old, with the kind of unnaturally calm demeanor that suggested either extensive training or pharmaceutical enhancement. "Who are you? And what is this place?" "My name is Dr. Rebecca Morrison. This is a research facility studying temporal manipulation for national security purposes. The time loop you've been experiencing is a containment protocol designed to prevent contamination of our research." Contamination. Knowledge of our work. When civilians become aware of classified temporal experiments, we use localized time loops to isolate and eventually eliminate the security breach. Chen realized the scope of what she was dealing with. The fatal accidents weren't random. They were assassination attempts designed to kill people who had witnessed classified experiments in time manipulation. How many people have you killed to protect your research? The loop resets their deaths, so technically no one dies permanently. We simply continue the loop until we find a scenario where the security breach is contained without leaving witnesses. But you're torturing people by forcing them to relive traumatic events repeatedly. Necessary sacrifices for national security. The knowledge of temporal manipulation cannot be allowed to spread to the general population. Chen looked at the countdown timer. 1 minute, 8 seconds. What happens when the timer reaches 0? If we cannot resolve the current security breach, the time loop resets again. We've run over 400 iterations testing different scenarios. Eventually, we'll find one where all witnesses are eliminated and the timeline can proceed normally. Chen realized she was not just trapped in a time loop. She was being systematically hunted by a government agency that viewed her knowledge as a security threat. Every reset gave them another opportunity to perfect their assassination attempts. How do I stop this? You can't. Even if you somehow prevent the accident and save Mr. Webb, we have multiple fail-safes. The loop will continue until all witnesses are eliminated, or until you agree to join our research program. Chen looked at the monitors showing Marcus Webb approaching the intersection. She had 30 seconds to make a choice that would affect not just her own life, but potentially the lives of everyone who had been trapped in these temporal experiments. She could try to expose the facility and break the loop, knowing that it might cost her life. Or she could agree to join their program and become part of the agency that was systematically eliminating civilian witnesses to classified research. The countdown timer reached 15 seconds. Chen made her choice. She drew her service weapon and began destroying the monitoring equipment, hoping that disrupting their surveillance capability might break their control over the time loop. "Officer Chen, you're making a serious mistake," Dr. Morrison warned. "Without our control systems, the time loop could collapse chaotically. Instead of resetting cleanly, it might fragment, trapping everyone in partial temporal loops or creating paradoxes that could affect the entire timeline." Chen paused. "What do you mean?" "Our research has shown that uncontrolled temporal manipulation can create ripple effects that extend far beyond the original loop. If this experiment collapses incorrectly, it could fragment time itself in this region, trapping thousands of people in overlapping temporal anomalies." The countdown timer reached 5 seconds. Chen had to choose between accepting imprisonment in an endless time loop controlled by a secretive government agency, or risking catastrophic temporal damage that could affect innocent people throughout Seattle. At the last second, Chen made a desperate gamble. Instead of destroying the equipment or submitting to the agency's control, she grabbed the manual override controls and attempted to extend the time loop indefinitely. Not to reset it, but to freeze it at the moment before the fatal accident. If she could create a permanent temporal suspension at 4:22 p.m., October 15, 2019, she might be able to prevent the accident without allowing the loop to reset or collapse. The countdown timer reached 0 just as Chen activated the override. What happened next would puzzle temporal researchers for decades. Instead of resetting or collapsing, the time loop stabilized at exactly 4:22:47 p.m., creating a permanent temporal bubble around the intersection of Pier and Madison. Inside the bubble, Marcus Webb remains forever frozen in mid-step, 3 seconds away from entering the intersection. Sarah Mitchell sits permanently suspended in her Honda Civic, her foot hovering above the brake pedal she would have pressed too late. Officer Lisa Chen stands motionless in the research facility, her hand still on the override controls. From the outside, the intersection appears normal, with people and vehicles moving through it continuously. But anyone who enters the temporal bubble experiences the same 47 seconds over and over again, while those outside observe what appears to be normal traffic flow. The government agency that created the time loop found that they could no longer access their research facility or extract their personnel. The building became a temporal dead zone, frozen at 4:22:47 p.m. indefinitely. Janet Harrison, still in her apartment but outside the temporal bubble, was the only witness to understand what had happened. She reported that Marcus Webb had simply vanished while walking to the gym, and that Officer Chen had disappeared while investigating her concerns about the repeated day. The Seattle Police Department investigated Chen's disappearance, but found no trace of the research facility or Dr. Morrison. Official records showed that 1247 Madison Street had been vacant for over 2 years, and there was no evidence that Chen had ever been inside the building. But sometimes, on quiet Tuesday afternoons, witnesses report seeing a police officer standing motionless at the intersection of Pier and Madison, visible for exactly 47 seconds before vanishing again. They say she appears to be reaching for something, her face showing the determination of someone making an impossible choice to save lives she'll never know were saved. Officer Lisa Chen had found a way to stop the time loop trap, but at the cost of trapping herself forever in the moment of her victory. In the space between 4:22 and 4:23 p.m. on October 15, 2019, she continues to guard the intersection where temporal manipulation meets human conscience, ensuring that some choices echo through eternity.